Hi, I'm Femi OK.
I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream.
Today, we continue our week-long look at the global impact of colonialism. Can the pain of our ancestors lived through be inherited? So some researchers say yes, and common symptoms include poor health, fear and anxiety, substance abuse, violence, and suicide.
There are critics, though, who say the science isn't solid and that the evidence is anecdotal at best. The growing study of epigenetics has found that the experiences of those who went before, such as trauma, can leave a mark on your genes. But is that enough to be passed on? Take a look at this primer from TED Ed on epigenetics and how some say it may affect trauma.
Genes in DNA are expressed when they're read and transcribed into RNA, which is translated into proteins by structures called ribosomes. And proteins are much of what determines a cell's characteristics and function. Epigenetic changes can boost or interfere with the transcription of specific genes. The most common way interference happens is that DNA, or the proteins it's wrapped around, gets labeled with small chemical tags. The set of all of the chemical tags that are attached to the genome of a given cell is called the epigenome. Even social experiences can cause epigenetic changes. In one famous experiment, when mother rats weren't attentive enough to their pups, genes in the babies that help them manage stress were methylated and turned off. And it might not stop with that generation. Most epigenetic marks are erased when egg and sperm cells are formed. But now, researchers think that some of those imprints survive.
So as always, this conversation is for you in our community. So in what ways has the trauma of colonialism influenced or maybe not affected your life? So many of you have already answered that question with #BecauseColonialism, and I'll be sharing your responses throughout the week. Join our conversation on Twitter or live on YouTube.
Here to break down the very complicated subject of intergenerational trauma in Melbourne, Australia, Catherine Chamberlain. She is Principal Investigator of Healing the Past by Nurturing the Future and is Associate Professor at the Judith Lumley Centre for Mother, Infant and Family Health Research.
In New Jersey, Limanuel Betsui is a diversity, equity and inclusion consultant and critical ethnographer and bioethicist. He's an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation.
And in Dublin, Ireland, Dr. Kevin Mitchell is a neurogeneticist and Associate Professor of Developmental Neuroscience and Genetics at Trinity College in Dublin. He's also author of Innate: How the Wiring of Our Brain Shapes Who We Are. I am not in the least bit intimidated by our guest lineup. All right, Kevin, help us out here with epigenetics. What is a simple way to understand how it works? What example would you share with our international audience?
Yeah, well, so I think the primer that you showed there gave a pretty good overview of the basic idea that epigenetics is a mechanism for turning genes on or turning them off. And during development of an embryo, that has to happen so that different cell types can express different proteins. So muscle cells become different from nerve cells and different from blood cells and so on. And that's not the only way it happens. So our genes also get regulated in response to experience. So one example would be if I go out in the sun for enough time, I can get a suntan. I know it doesn't look like it, but I can. And that suntan basically is a molecular change in my cells that is turning on some genes that produce the pigment that is visible in the skin. And that change lasts for a while. It lasts for weeks to months. Now, some people think that kind of change can last a lifetime or even be inherited to the next generation. But I think if you think about that example of a suntan, clearly that's not going to be inherited by my children or my grandchildren. So when it comes to the idea of epigenetics regulating our psychology in ways that's passed down molecularly through the generations, I'm really a skeptic about that, though I'm perfectly absolutely convinced of the intergenerational effects of trauma that can be mediated through social and cultural and historical and psychological and familial effects. I just don't think that we need to invoke this molecular mechanism of epigenetics to try and explain that.
Lee, in your work, how does epigenetics feature? How are you using it?
So I grew up on the Navajo Reservation in New Mexico. And in the region that I grew up, there are 3 coal-powered power plants. So all of the air pollution that is having an effect on current generations. So there could be a chance of some sort of modification or impact on the genes of the people who are breathing that air, and it could modify their genes, and that could be passed down to their children and so forth. And so while I understand the suntan example, there's also the environment that can have an impact on our lives and that we can pass on to our children and future generations. And so this is a personal subject area for me, because I also look at the historical trauma of the government boarding school experience that my parents and some of my grandparents had. And in these government boarding schools, they were subjected to all sorts of abuse, verbal, physical, and sexual. And so that had an impact on their mindsets and on their psyches, which is why sometimes people think that Indigenous people or Aboriginal people are anti-education or anti-science. It's not that we are anti-education or anti-science. We have a distrust of the government and other governmental entities, but we're breaking through that trust. But we're also not anti-science. We're actually trying to democratize scientific research so that it's applicable and really tangible to our communities.
The example that you gave of Indigenous communities and how it relates to them now is something that resonates with our online community. I wanted to share this from Isis, who says, because colonialism, Black people are still living with generational trauma, the effects of a cruel system that dehumanized our ancestors. Colonialism is still visible today. The system it created is still in existence. Our people are suffering and living in abject poverty. So she mixes a few things there. But Catherine, I wanted to give this one to you to ask, what is the link between epigenetics and intergenerational trauma? How are those two things related, if at all?
Well, I'm not an epigeneticist, I'm an epidemiologist, so we look at the patterns of disease. So I think I'll leave the epigenetics to those people to talk about, but certainly in terms of the patterns of intergenerational trauma that we're seeing, there's really strong epidemiological evidence. So for me, my background's in midwifery before coming into public health, and the key for me to be understanding it is to understand that trauma is related to our natural human survival mechanisms, and to think about it in terms of millions of years. What have we had to do to survive? And essentially it's related to 3 main things: our fear centre, so our flight, fright and fight responses that we need to do. And we have to remember that as human beings, we're the most successful species on the planet in terms of survival. So these instincts are really strong. So we have our really strong fight, flight and fright responses that relate to childhood trauma. And when these are activated, it's about 500 times faster than conscious thought, and it overrides everything else in the body. And once that has been activated in response to one initial threat that might have occurred at any stage during somebody's life, even in utero or in birth, we know that can be activated really more readily. So, for example, even here in Australia with some floods that we had a year or 2 ago, the babies that were born at that time had higher cortisol levels than before. So there are immediate and ongoing effects of any exposure or threat, particularly in early childhood, and we can override that with our with our brain. And that can be like a break in some ways, but it is very strong, those survival instincts. And the other thing I think that's really important to understand with trauma is that we're all social beings. Connecting with each other and socialising with each other is very important. Humans in particular, we have very strong need for attachment, and our children, when they're born, they're dependent on us for a long time. So if there's trauma that happens in that early childhood time, that can conflict with the flight and fight response can
I'm so glad that you mentioned that,
attachment.
Catherine, because I wanted to share a personal story from a member of our community who talks about what trauma in his life has meant and where he's directed that. So this is from Lani Pikoli. He's a journalist and an author in South Africa. Have a listen.
I have been affected by generational trauma, intergenerational trauma, and colonialism through the systems of discrimination that were apartheid and colonialism, which has also sort of seeped into me personally via things like depression, anxiety, purely based off socioeconomic situations, and I guess also environment. And yeah, I'm addressing it through my writing by speaking things into existence that my generation has never really had an opportunity.
So Kevin, that's one anecdote from a person who is dealing with his trauma, but I wanted to share this and get your thoughts on this. So this is a tweet circulating online. There's lots like it. Mark says, fascinating study. Descendants of concentration camp survivors inherited adverse brain changes. And he's citing a study that was done by researchers in the Czech Republic. Here's one from 2019. You can see that headline there. And another, this from 2015, descendants of Holocaust survivors have altered stress hormones. Kevin, what do you make of a study like this and findings like these?
Yeah. Well, can I just say in response to some of the things that the other guests have said, they've really laid out, some of the psychological and social and cultural effects and some of the biological effects of for example, really early childhood trauma on that person. And of course, those can be passed in a sense to the next generation through affecting the interrelationship there and affecting the culture more broadly. But when it comes to some of these discoveries that are trying to invoke these sort of epigenetic changes, first of all, I don't know why they want to. It feels to me like it's historians and sociologists reaching for this sciencey term that as if they need that to give some validity to their the descriptions of those experiences. I don't think that's needed at all. I think they're completely convincing as they are, whereas the scientific studies are really not convincing. And I've looked into many of them in detail, and they all tend to suffer from some of the same methodological problems. So they tend to have very, very small steps.
Let me just move on just a little bit.
Kevin.
Yeah, Lee, you pick up while we reconnect with Kevin.
Sure. So I would have to push back on that, because in terms of the critiques have been that some of these studies are too small and they're not large scale. However, I go back to the point of why I became involved in this work and this type of research, is because we need to increase the number of Indigenous people who are researchers and scholars and scientists, so that we can start to address these questions and these challenges that we've been facing. And we want to be able to connect the dots between the trauma of colonialism and intergenerational trauma. And that's why, and I have read many of these studies, and there are small sample sizes, but that's why, as an Indigenous person and as an Indigenous advocate for increasing the number of Indigenous scientists, we want to do that so that we can even have larger scale studies to really delve, dig deeper and drill deeper, so that we can find some of those answers. And that's really complementary to the work that you're doing.
Sure, I completely agree with that. I think Indigenous peoples, first of all, need to be more personally involved in any research involving them, and that we need to increase the number of people in samples and so on. But it's not just the small sample size that is the problem with some of these studies. It's that they tend to have a really vague hypothesis. So rather than saying, okay, I think this particular gene is going to be changed, they say, I think some gene somewhere is going to be changed in some way in some of these people. And so when you do the statistics, then it looks like anything that comes out is significant. But if you've done 1,000 tests, you're definitely going to see something in a small sample that is just statistical noise. And so all of these problems, all of these studies suffer from the same set of methodological problems
So,
Yeah,
Guess,
can I-
there is an area where you all agree, because you come from communities that have all been colonised. So, Kevin, you're Irish.
Yes.
Lee, you come from the Navajo tribes, the Navajo community, and Catherine, Tasmania, again, was an area that was colonised. I want to just get out of you the stories that actually bind you together rather than science that actually is perhaps pushing you apart. Lee, you start first of all, because I know that there are certain areas where I know you connect with Kevin and I know you connect with Catherine, because the communities have had the same kind of subjugation. Tell me about that.
Sure, I'm happy to. I came into this work, as I mentioned earlier, through examining the ethical, legal, and social implications of genetic research. And I'm not a geneticist myself, but my entree into this work was really taking a look again at the loss of language and culture. And that's what has happened throughout the world. And I think that's where we have something in common, the three of us here who are having this conversation today. Yeah. And because of the loss of language, there's a loss of culture. And as Indigenous people, some of us can still speak our languages, we still are practicing our culture, we still have our spiritual beliefs and spiritual systems. And some of those answers that we're facing now can actually be found within our cultural knowledge bases. I'm not saying that we're going to go back to a time before pre-colonial contact, but what I'm saying is that some of the knowledge that we have from a ethnomedicine standpoint and perspective complements modern medicine and modern scientific research.
Lee, I have to ask you this, because we had this debate in our office, basically because our executive producer is Irish, and he was insistent that the Irish are colonised and they are still suffering from colonisation. Can you put that into words for us so our international audience understand that?
Sure. You take a look at what's happening.
I'm going to ask the Irishman if that's okay.
Yes.
Right, yeah.
It seems only fair. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think very much echoing what Lee said there. The most obvious effect is on the language itself, which was suppressed under 800 years of English rule, and is still not very widely spoken at all. Everyone learns Irish in school, but not particularly effectively. And so, that's a huge part. That's the anchor of our own culture that was suppressed for all that time. And of course, any colony that's emerging from colonialism has all of the issues of the economic issues, where they have been governed from the outside and now have to govern themselves, and certainly the Irish state went through a period that's taken it's nearly 100 years now of independence, and we're well on our own 2 feet, but that those effects still took a long time to get over economically and socially.
I want to share another story, someone who references that idea of it taking a long time to get over, and some people still not over it. This is Clément Baloup. He's a graphic novelist in France, and he shares his story with us.
My work is mainly about the Vietnamese community, the diaspora that is living outside Vietnam. I got interested in this particular story because of my father, that is Vietnamese and that had to flee Vietnam during the war. I started to dig into this kind of mysterious story because I have no real idea about what happened to this part of my family. And so I discovered what the Vietnamese called the American War. I was kind of surprised of what I was discovering because a lot of facts were very horrible. It was kind of a trauma, but if this story never happened, I will never be born, as simple as that.
So, Catherine, keeping that in mind, I want to share this with you. Iworo on Twitter says, there is no reversing the damage, so to speak, and living with the glaring and unrelenting consequences hardly encourages healing. The idea of reparations was once floated, but I think an apology is a good start. This should be followed by visible change in Western policy. And this person specifically is talking about the continent of Africa, but I think many people can relate to his tweet. But I want to pick out of that the healing. How do you go about doing that?
Well, I think that there's absolutely hope for healing. Like here in Australia, before colonisation, we had really sophisticated ways of, nurturing our children, and culture really kept us strong and connecting with each other. And I think we are seeing the effects of it, of the last couple of hundred years of colonisation here, which is pretty recent compared to a lot of other countries, and all that violence that has occurred. But essentially, I think getting back to remembering, learning from our elders, getting back to that culture, I think, and understanding it is going to be absolutely critical for our healing. I do
Catherine,
think the apology
I'm
is
going to bring
important.
up a four-letter word. I'm counting on my hands here. Love. That's something that you talk about a lot. And I feel if we do not mention that, we wouldn't have done our job, because you talk about that as a way of healing. Can you just very briefly, because we're right at the end of the show, explain what you mean by love helping to heal entire generations?
Yeah, so that's sort of the focus of our research on healing the past by nurturing the future. And we do know from the research that rewiring, that love is the healing salve for trauma, and that is being connected with other people, having relationships. There's particular times in the life, during our lives when that's more possible. So the transition to becoming a parent is really, really important.
Catherine,
and babies
let's put that
love into the world.
Let's put that to our skeptic, Kevin. Kevin, we've got love. We've got perhaps the idea that your trauma from your ancestors can be carried forward in a scientific way. You have no track with that. But what can you do?
But the love thing is fine. I'm all for that. Because we can collectively at least attempt to change the culture, attempt to change the society, and of course attempt to change the economy, and change the nature of the relationships that we have with each other, with other communities that we share our countries with. And we can see this now in Northern Ireland, where communities that have been at each other's throats for decades have seen peace now and reconciliation over time, although it's currently threatened by politics in the UK. But sure, absolutely. I mean, the idea that the sort of positive emotions and positive aspects of our relationships can change the way that we individually feel and the way that we relate to each other, that absolutely makes complete sense to me.
And can I also add in, there's a lot of science around things like dancing and singing. So probably if we did more, dancing and singing together, and things that are fun and more enjoyable rather than fighting and arguing, I think we'd be, and incorporating our culture and celebrating it and having a real renaissance of that, we'd be well on the way to healing some of this stuff that's gone on in the past and that we're still carrying with us today in all the ways that we talked about.
We are about to wrap up.
We're about to about love.
Thank you.
Can I just make one more comment
in a sentence you can do it, because we're right at the end of the show. Sorry to hurry you. Go ahead.
No, we still have to deal with settler colonialism. And so while we are addressing some of these issues, we constantly go out into society with reminders that we have been colonized. And so that is also required a team effort to break down that type of mentality, to let people understand that we're here. We're not historical figures. We're here today. We've been here. We will always be here. This is our land.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Kevin, as well, for helping us explore this idea in today's show. That's all the time we have. On the next stream, we continue our special week of shows on colonialism. The long arm of Beijing. Is China's global development drive a win-win or modern-day imperialism?
Lots to discuss. Remember, the hashtag is #BecauseColonialism. We'll see you online.